أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع ذنوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين واللعنة الدائم على أعدائهم أجمعين أما بعد فقد قال الله الحكيم في محكم كتابه الكريم أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ورد الله الذين كفروا بغيظهم لم ينالوا خيرا وكفى الله المؤمنين القتال وكان الله قويا عزيزا صدق الله العلي العظيم صلوات اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. For the love of our beloved Prophet and his beloved progeny, please recite a second loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala. For the hastening in the return of our beloved 12th Imam, a third final loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Yesterday we ended our discussion right in the middle of the battle of Ahzab. These mushrikeen have come, and the news came to the Prophet. He came together with his companions to dig up this trench. And while they were digging up this trench, there were a number of issues that created problems for these Muslims. Mainly, it was the drought and the hunger that you found in the city of Medina. And we went through some of the stories in which the Prophet had to come. There were people who would invite him to their houses. He would take the rest of the Muslims with them. And there are many stories that have narrated the miracles of the Prophet during this time of difficulty for the people of Medina. Because not only was there a drought, but as you are digging this trench, your movement from inside to outside the city, your business transactions, all of this stuff starts to fall apart because you are now in a war zone, essentially. And we went through this, and we also mentioned that the Prophet gave a great promise to his people while they were digging up this trench, while this army is about to come, 10,000 strong. They're coming not this time only from Mecca and the other parts of the Arabian Peninsula to put an end to Muhammad and his followers once and for all. This is the ultimate showdown that the Muslims will ever have to go through. And the promise that the Prophet gave them was that not only would you be victorious in this battle, in fact, there is a fate and a future that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has decreed for the Muslim ummah, such that the great empires of your time will also be overthrown by you. And many of those who were with the Prophet naturally could not believe this, just like the way you and I cannot believe necessarily some of the promises that Quran and Hadith gives us as well. And this is where roughly we ended the story, and we said that Bani Qurayza also broke their peace treaty with the Prophet. So now these Muslims, as the Quran says, they felt like they were being attacked from the top and the bottom. إِذْ جَاءُوكُم مِّن فَوْقِكُمْ وَمِنْ أَسْفَلَ مِنْكُمْ. When the moments became so difficult that you felt like you were being attacked from the top, this is the north of Medina, وَمِنْ أَسْفَلَ مِنْكُمْ. And this verse is a very beautiful verse because it's talking about how things were literally and metaphorically. Metaphorically, when you feel like you're being attacked heavily, people will say you feel like you're being attacked from every side. This is what the Quran is saying. You felt like you were being attacked from every side. And literally, they were being attacked from every side as well. And the Quran says, وَإِذْ زَاغَتِ الْأَبْصَارِ. When the eyes were getting blurry, in shock, and you didn't know what to do. وَبَلَغَتِ الْقُلُوبُ الْحَنَاجِرِ. And you could feel your hearts in your throats. This is where we ended. Tonight, inshallah, we'll continue with the second part of the Battle of Ahzab and the many lessons that we can learn from it, inshallah. And to do so, we will pose the following 7 questions. Number 1, what parallels do we find between the beginning of the time of the Prophet and his prophethood and the return of our 12th Imam? What similarities do we find between these two? Number 2, what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say about the munafiqeen who secretly used to leave digging the trench, and they used to go home and they used to use different excuses not to have to work for the Prophet? What does he say about them? Number 3, what did Safiya, the aunt of the Prophet, do when the women and the children were alone in Medina and one of the people of Bani Qurayza came to hurt them? Number 4, when Amr ibn Abd Wud, when he made his way over the trench and he started to challenge the Muslims, what poetry did he recite? And what poetry did Ali ibn Abi Talib recite in response to him? Number 5, what 7 moments were there that years later Ali ibn Abi Talib, when he was speaking to his companions, would highlight as those moments that he was the only one to support the Prophet in those moments? Number 6, what was the way the Prophet dealt with the Jewish tribe of Bani Qurayza after the Battle of Ahzab? Was it a cruel way of dealing with them? Or was it the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and a form of defense? And number 7, and finally, what made this army of Ahzab, these 10,000, finally leave the siege of Medina? And what big lesson can we learn from what caused them to leave? Tonight, inshallah, we'll delve into these 7 questions with a loud salawat ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. These Muslims were digging up the trench, and the Prophet gave them the promise that one day you would take over everything. And we said that these Muslims were surprised by this, this telling of the future by the Prophet and this promise of the Prophet, because they're in a situation right now where tens, thousands of people are coming trying to kill them. They're going to shed their blood. And yet this Prophet is still telling them that there's going to come a time, forget about these guys, Rome and Persia and Yemen and all the great empires of the world, you're going to take over. And this surprise that the Muslims had at that time, and the surprise you and I have in the belief that the return of the 12th Imam is going to come, have a lot of parallels with one another. In fact, the very movement of the Prophet and the movement of the 12th Imam have very clear parallels of one another. Because the movement of the Prophet began after there was many years of darkness and injustice, misguidance. People had no one to look forward to, no one to get behind, no one to guide them. And this is also what happens with the coming of the 12th Imam. That people feel in so much darkness, they feel like muli'at dhulman wa jawra, that the whole earth is full of injustice, it's full of oppression. Then when he begins, the first showdown that the Prophet had was the Battle of Badr. How many were there? 313. And that is why our narrations say that when the 12th Imam comes, the initial group around him are how many? They are 313. In fact, the narration doesn't say necessarily 313 every time. It says the same number that were there in Badr. This is the clear parallel. And then the message of the Prophet is going to go quickly. It's going to grow quicker than most people would assume. This is also what happens with the 12th Imam. And then it will reach a point where all of the good people of the world will be on one side and all of the evil people of the world will be on the other side. And this is exactly what's happening in Ahzab. And this is what's going to change the tide. Everything is going to change from this point onwards. The highlights in the history of Islam, Badr, Ahzab, and the conquest of Mecca. These 3 are the ones, the big ones, where everything changed for the Muslims. And this is also what will happen with the 12th Imam, because all the good will be on one side, all the bad will be on another side. The good will become stronger in their faith, though their numbers might be less. The bad will also become stronger in their opposition, because they are now focused. They are now purified in the sense that all the bad people are in one location. It's not good and bad mixed with each other. In today's world, there's good and bad mixed among societies. When the 12th Imam comes, the lines are drawn. Good and bad separate each other from one another. This is exactly what is happening in Ahzab as well. So the Prophet gave them this promise. And while they were digging this trench, the Quran says that some of these munafiqeen, they used to leave the work that the Prophet was doing. Because the Muslims, they were in a rush before the army of Mecca comes. But then some of these munafiqeen, slowly from here and there, they used to leave, they used to go home. And the Quran says clearly, قَدْ يَعْلَمُ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ يَتَسَلَّلُونَ مِنْكُمْ لِوَاذًا. We see those folks who go and hide in their little corners here and there. What is he saying? These are the munafiqeen. When it comes time to get the work done, initially they say, yes, we're with you. Whatever you tell us, Ya Rasulullah, we're there. We'll help you, we'll support you, we'll do everything. Then when the time for work comes and they have to actually help, what do? They go hide in their corner. They say that the rest of them will take care of it. These guys will come, they'll take care of it. But then if we're victorious, they'll come and say, Ya Rasulullah, we were all together. MashaAllah, what a great victory. And if you're defeated, they'll come and tell you, oh, you shouldn't have listened to this prophet anyways. It's like a win-win for them. No matter what, they're not going to lose. And the Quran says this is the characteristic of a munafiq. That's what a munafiq does. He lets other people move forward. Yeah, let them go take care of it. I'm not going to help. I'm not going to do anything. But I'm still going to act like I was part of the group. Still going to sit there and say, yeah, we're all together. What an amazing job. But when it comes time for work, I'm going to go hide in my corner. يَتَسَلَّلُونَ لِوَاذًا. And the Quran says, we see you. We know exactly who you are. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala never mentions these munafiqeen by name. Never does. He just gives Muslims the principles. Says this is the akhlaq of nifaq. Now, when the Quran says this person is munafiq, and this person had nifaq in his heart, there are people who have full nifaq in their hearts. You point to them and you say, this is munafiq. Then there are people like the rest of us. We are not munafiq. We might have characteristics, like the characteristics of nifaq sometimes make their way into our hearts. The same way like you and I, when we sin, we're not kafir. But that sin is a manifestation of a form of disbelief in us. It's a manifestation of kufr in us. Of course, Quran will not call you and I kafir. You're not kafir. I'm not kafir. You could commit many sins and not be kafir. But the Quran says this act that you did, the essence of it, if you boil it down, the essence of it is the essence of disbelief. And this characteristic, the essence of it is the essence of hypocrisy. Not that the one who does it is hypocrite all of a sudden. No. It means the essence of it, the fabric of it, yes? There is, hypocrisy is a spectrum, the same way faith is a spectrum. Colors are a spectrum? Sometimes you have yellow, you have red, and then you have a shade of yellow, a shade of red. This is what Quran is saying. And this is an important lesson for you and I to learn. Because not only on a political level, societal level, you will see this, even on a personal level, you'll see this. Sometimes in our own families. We come together as one unit, we're going to take care of something, and then you'll see some people, they'll sit back in the corner and say, let the rest of the people do it. You're not part of this family? I am part of this family, but let the rest of them do it. She'll take care of it, he'll take care of it, it's okay. She needs my help, but it's okay. This is not, Quran says this is not the akhlaq of a true believer. When you're with the units, then you contribute and you help and you don't try to go into corners. And there were those who had excuses and they had to walk away. And the Quran says their excuses were valid excuses. And there are those who used to come up with excuses and their excuses were fake excuses. Sometimes the excuse is a valid excuse, sometimes it's not. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can tell the difference between these two. Recite a salawat, please. The history tells us that now the army of Ahzab came and started to lay siege to the city of Medina, and this would continue maybe roughly for a whole month. And at this time, there is not battle that's taking place between these two sides. Only thing that is happening is that you have the mushrikeen on the other side, and the Muslimin have to constantly guard this trench because they don't know when there is going to be an attack, when there isn't going to be an attack. So the narration says that the Prophet had divided his companions and they used to watch over the trench, especially during nighttime because you can't see what's happening. And they used to go around the trench and they used to constantly give takbir. And the narration says they were in so much fear that they gave this takbir over and over until morning time used to come. And the narration says the Prophet himself would go and guard the trench too. And there were times he was calling out takbir too. And Salama narrates for us. She says the Prophet used to go himself. And he used to come back and he used to rest. And then he used to go himself watching this trench. And amongst those who was watching the trench was, of course, none but Ali ibn Abi Talib. He's watching this trench on this side. Which is part of the reason why on the other side, Bani Qurayza is still there. They might do anything at any moment. And the narration says that as this side was being guarded and Ali ibn Abi Talib was on this side, one of these nights, some of the Jewish men of Bani Qurayza then started their movement. And the Prophet sent a couple hundred from this side, from the north to the south. You see, this is the Prophet. He's trying to manage both sides at the same time. And they were able to push them back and push them back. The narration says one of these nights, one of them came close to the area where the women and children had been stationed in. Because if you remember, we said the women and children were stationed inside of Medina, not near the trench. So the narration says one of these men came, and these women started to hear the noise coming from outside. That this man has come now, and he has evil intentions. And the narration says Safiya, the aunt of the Prophet, turned to another companion of the Prophet who was there, but he was he wasn't one of those brave people, so they had put him there, not in the battlefield. And Safiya turned to this man and he said, go and take care of him for us. I mean, you're the only man here. You should go and take care of him for us. And he said, Safiya, you know I can't do this type of stuff. And the narration says the aunt of the Prophet herself went, and she carried with her a dagger. In the middle of the night, she went and took care of this guy. But this is the type of fear and the type of threat that the Muslims are under. That from every side, you can be attacked at any moment. And so the Prophet is trying to cover both sides. And on the side of the trench, every day, these kuffar and mushrikeen, they used to come. Every day, one group of them, one battalion is trying to get over this trench. One day, Khalid ibn Walid and his people, they're trying to get over the trench. One day, Ikrama, the son of Abu Jahl, because Abu Jahl is long gone by now, yes? Ikrama, the son of Abu Jahl, is trying to get over. One day, Abu Sufyan and his group are trying to get over. And every time they were taunting these Muslims because they wanted these Muslims to react to them. Because as long as they're on this side, there's not much you can do. So they used to taunt these Muslims. And the Prophet had told the Muslims that you don't move from your place. And the only thing that was happening at this time were very small skirmishes that was happening with arrows going between the two sides. Because they had this trench between them, it's just arrows going back and forth. Up until here, everything is fine and nice. And you think, oh, the Muslims pulled it off, alhamdulillah, it's done. But there's one other big twist to the story that's coming our way. Because as long as these folks are on the other side of the trench, wonderful, alhamdulillah, no problem. But God forbid if they get to this side of the trench. God forbid if someone makes it over to this side of the trench, then what are you going to do? And the narration says one of these days, these mushrikeen, some of their strongest warriors came together in a group of 6 or 7, and they finally found a place of the trench that they could get over. And they got over the trench. And the narration says the Prophet saw this. And he ordered Ali ibn Abi Talib to go and guard that part of the trench so that more could not come on this side. So they covered that part, and Muslims came, the guards came, and they covered that part of the trench. But the problem you have on your hand now is that 5 or 6 of these big warriors are on this side now. And the narration says when they came on this side, initially the Muslims were around the Prophet. When they came on this side, they all started to move back, and now the Prophet was in front of all of them. It's like a emotional, retreat. Just naturally because of who's on this side of the trench. And of course, amongst those who had made it on this side of the trench was Amr ibn Abd Wud. A little bit about who this man is. Amr has now made it on this side. This was the person that Ali ibn Abi Talib talks about in his own narrations. Years later, he says Amr was Farisu Quraysh. He was the warrior of Quraysh. He was the warrior of all of Arab. Quraysh is one part. He's the warrior of all of Arab. This is the main guy they used to look at. They used to call him the rider of Yalyal. Why? Yalyal was the name of this place. One day he was going by with his friends. The enemy came towards them. He told his friends, you all leave. I'll take care of the enemy by myself. And he did it. They called him Farisu Yalyal. And people used to say, Amr is equal to 1,000 on the other side. This doesn't mean literally. They were trying to say, this is the type of power that Amr has. And Ali says later on in his own narrations, he says Amr came to this side like an intoxicated camel. Like there's nothing that would stop him in that moment. You just had to deal with him. Amr comes to this side. Out of these 5 or 6 that are with Amr, they don't come to engage in battle. Amr comes and he is now going to challenge for Mubaraza. Mubaraza is that one-on-one battle. So the narration says, these Muslims were all extremely quiet in these moments. And they were afraid, so much so that they had now moved behind the Prophet. But the Prophet did not move from where he was standing. Hence, they are now behind the Prophet. The Prophet is in reality in front of them. And the narration says, Amr started to ride his horse back and forth. And he called out, he said, Hal min mubaris? Anyone? Anyone's going to come challenge me? And the narration says the whole area was so quiet. كَأَنَّ عَلَى رُؤُوسِهِمُ الطَّيْرِ. There's a saying in Arabic, when you're so quiet and you don't move at all, they say it's as if there's a bird on top of his head. Because a bird's not going to move, sit on something that's moving, yes? Sits on an object that's completely motionless. Said it was so quiet, no one would even want to move in these moments. He called out, he said, Hal min mubariz? And the Prophet said, Man li hadha al-kalb? Who's going to go deal with this guy? And no response. Quiet. What about all of these companions? No one. Ali ibn Abi Talib says, that day, no one even wanted to deal with Amr. No one even wanted a piece of this guy. He called out, the Prophet said, who's going to go? Nobody went. So Amr then started to ride his horse again. And in some narrations it says he took his spear and he was pointing his spear at the Prophet, like, challenging him with all of his audacity. Then he rode again and he said, listen, you all say that if any of you dies, they go to heaven. And if any of us dies, they go to hell. So there's no believer who wants to go to heaven today? There's no believer who wants to put a mushrik in hellfire today? Either you come, you win, or you lose. If you win, you're going to go to heaven. If you lose, if you win, you're going to put me in hellfire. If you win, you go to heaven. Which one is it? Which one do you want? It's a win-win based on what you all believe in. And he called out, he said, Hal min mubariz? Is there anyone who wants to come? And the narration says it was extremely quiet again. And every time Ali ibn Abi Talib used to get up and say, Ana ya Rasulullah, I can take care of him. And the Prophet told him, sit down. And it was very clear that the Prophet wanted to see who else is going to get up. Who else? Who else even dares to mention their name right now? Second time, he said, who's going to come challenge me? Ali got up. He said, Ana lahu ya Rasulullah, leave him to me. And the Prophet said, Ijlis, sit. Who else wants to go? Nobody. The third time, he rode his horse again and he started to recite poetry. And this poetry now started to turn into a moment of embarrassment for the Muslims. Because he started to recite poetry, he said, وَلَقَدْ بَحَحْتُ مِنَ النِّدَى بِجَمْعِهِمْ هَلْ مِن مُبَارِزِ. I called for someone to come and challenge me so much, I got tired. There's no one here. And Ali got up this third time. He said, Ana ya Rasulullah, let me go. And this third time, the Prophet said, it's okay, you can go. And before he could go, the Prophet told him, Udnu minni, come closer to me. And the narration says he came closer. He prepared Dhul Faqar for him and handed Dhul Faqar in his hands. And then the narration says he took his own imama from his own head. He put the imama on the head of Ali. And Ali years later will talk about this. He says, وَعَمَّمَنِي بِيَدِهِ. He put his imama on my head with his own 2 hands. And then he told him, Imdi, now you can go. And the narration says, as Ali was walking towards the battlefield, then the Prophet made a dua. Look at this dua that the Prophet made. He raised his hands. He said, Ya Allah, in the battle of Badr, you took Ubaidah, my cousin, away from me. And in Uhud, you took my uncle Hamza away from me. Oh Allah, this is Ali, don't leave me alone anymore. Don't take Ali away from me. At least let me keep Ali. لا تذرني فردا. Don't leave me by myself. And then as Ali was walking loud enough that everyone could hear, the Prophet then said this one line. He said, فَقَدْ بَرَزَ الْإِسْلَامُ كُلُّهُ إِلَى الشِّرْكِ كُلِّهِ. He said, all of Islam is going up against all of shirk today. Ya Ali. Put yourself in these moments, the heart of the Prophet, the heart of Ali. What does this moment even look like? You and I cannot even imagine what this moment looks like. And the narration says Ali went closer and then he started to recite poetry that was a response to the poetry of Amr. Because Amr said, I kept calling, no one came to respond to me. And then Ali recited this poetry. He said, لا تعجلن فقد أتاك. He said, not so fast, don't rush. The one who came to respond to you has come. He said, he has come to you and he is powerful. And then the poetry continues and he says, Amr, you know what I want to do to you today? This is not Ali, the compassionate one. This is not Ali, the one who the cry of the orphan breaks his heart. That's Ali when it's time for compassion and all of that. This is Ali now when there's an enemy and he has to deal with the enemy. Otherwise, all of these Muslims will be forgotten about. The Prophet said in his du'as, Ya Allah, if today doesn't go well, you will not be worshipped on earth anymore. This is it. This is Ali, the warrior, huh? It's the same one who the cry of the orphan breaks his back, huh? But this is the other side of Ali. He went there, he said, he responded to him. He said, the one that you were asking, you said, no one comes to respond to me. La ta'ajilana, don't rush, not so fast. Faqad ataka, I've come. And he said, you know what I want to do to you, Amr? I want to do something to you, Amr, that men and women will sit and they will mourn your death. And then he continued, and he said, Amr, you know what your problem was? This is my wording. Say, you know what your mistake was? You challenged the young man who actually responds to the challenge. You challenged the wrong person. He said, you call to Mubaraza the one who accepts the challenge to Mubaraza. Amr saw this. He said, who are you? He said, I am Ali. He said, Ali, son of who? He said, I am Ali, the son of Abu Talib. And Ali, Amr on the other side, maybe with a smirk on his face, maybe he was fearful for his own life. Some scholars have said this as well. He came up with an excuse quickly. He said, Ali, go back. There's people who are older than you. You're young. You go back. Some of your uncles are older than you. Tell them to come. And then he said this one line. And he said, Ali, you can go. Tell them to send someone older than you. Because Ali at this point is maybe 30 years old. And he said, I don't want to shed your blood. I'm going to spare your life. And you know what Ali responded to him? Ali said, listen, you don't want to shed my blood. You want to spare my life. But guess what? I don't want to spare your life. I want to put you to death. And then he turned to Amr. He said, Amr, I've heard in Jahiliyyah when you used to go to war, you used to tell people, whoever asks you for 3 wishes, you'd grant one of them. He said, yes, this is true. He said, well, I have 3 wishes that I want to ask you for. He said, what are these 3 wishes? He said, number 1, believe in the Prophet. You know he's a messenger of God. Don't oppose him like this. Amr just laughed this off. He said, forget about this one. What's number 2? I'm not doing this one. He said, okay, number 2. Number 2 is this. Don't go to war with him. Leave him be. Go back to Mecca. Well, it doesn't create a problem for you. Go back to Mecca. Maybe the rest of Arab come and they get rid of Muhammad for you. You have nothing to worry about. And Amr looked at this and said, no. I can't do that. What will they say about me? They will say Amr came and he was afraid for his life. He came back. He said, no. He said, tell me, what's your third wish? He said, my third wish is for you and I to go to war. He said, my third wish is mubaraza. And Amr said, I can grant you that wish. And the narration says he was so arrogant, he jumped off of his horse. Because he was on the horse and Ali was on foot. He jumped off of his horse. He cut the feet of the horse. He hamstrung the horse. And this was a terrible thing that he did. But he was saying, listen, I can be on foot. I can take care of you. This was him being bold. He got down on foot. And the narration says in these moments, he rushed towards Ali. And he struck Ali. And Ali himself says years later, he went for my head first and foremost. He went for my head, and Ali says, I held my shield up. But this was not the metal type of shield. This was the type of shield that they used to make with a thick part of skin. Multiple pieces of skin they would put together. And hence he held this shield up, and the sword came through the shield, and it cracked the head of Ali. It wounded the head of Ali. But in the pressure of this, he turned around and went for the feet of Amr. And the narration says in these moments, the Muslims were looking at what was happening, this back and forth. We couldn't tell what was happening because there was dust up in the air. We didn't know what was happening. All we knew is that somewhere in the middle of this dust, then all of a sudden we heard takbir. And then when the dust settles, Jabir says, when the dust settled, then we saw Ali is sitting on his chest. And he's about to put an end to him. And the narration says before he put an end to him, he got up. And the Muslims, some of them on this side, they said, Ali, what are you doing? Put an end to him, it's done. And they say Ali walked around. And the Prophet told them, he said, Ali will explain to you why he's doing this. Then at one point he came and he sat and he did the job. He walked back. And he walked back with his head. And the narration says his clothing, the blood was still dripping from it. And he walked back with so much pride. The Prophet looked at this moment. He said, Allah never likes for a servant to walk like this except for a moment like this. Except when you're dealing with the enemies of God. This He loves because of this position. Outside of this position, should never be walking like this with pride. But what Ali is doing in this moment is 100% appropriate. He came back. They said, Ya Ali, you should have finished them off earlier. He said, no, he spat in my face. And he started to swear at my mother. And because of this, I didn't do it in that moment. To not do it out of my anger, but to do it because Allah wants me to do this. And the narration says when Ali then came back to these Muslims, the whole tune of this war changed. And the Prophet famously said that the fighting of Ali on that day is greater in reward than the reward of everything that ins and jinn will ever do. And you might say, just one fight? But if it wasn't for this one fight, this Islam would have never even made it this far. It's a critical role with the best of intentions, the purest of intentions, not emotions, because he knows Allah wants him to do this. He came back. And years later, when Ali ibn Abi Talib is alone with his companions and they are disobeying him, this is now at the battle of Nahrawan. He's already been through the battle of Jamal. He's already been through the battle of Siffin. They've already disobeyed him multiple times. The narration says this Jewish man came to the masjid. He saw Ali ibn Abi Talib. He said, I want to ask you some questions. If you can answer them, you are truly the successor of your prophet. And he started to ask him some questions. And then Ali ibn Abi Talib turned towards him. He said, let me tell you something. This is how you know I'm the successor of this prophet. He said, because when the successor of any prophet is alive, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will test him while the prophet is still alive. While that prophet is still alive, He will test the successor. And Allah tested me on 7 times. And this Jewish man said, what are these 7 times? I need to know what are these 7 times. And Ali turned towards him. He said, let's go over there and I'll tell you. And his companion said, Ya Ali, you can speak in front of us. And Ali said, no, you all don't believe me already. you all don't obey me already. This is after Jamal, this is after Siffin. We all know what they did in Siffin. He said, you all don't believe in me already. And Malik Ashtar said, no, Ya Ali, stay. Speak of these 7 times. And he said, fine, I'll sit and I'll stay. And he started to explain. He said the first time was that time when the Prophet was extremely alone. He had nobody with him. And the first time was when there was the gathering of Ashiratul Aqrabin. Nobody stood up to support the Prophet, but I stood up. And he said, every time he mentioned one of these, he turned to his companions. He said, isn't this true? They all said, yes, Ya Amir al-Mu'minin, you're right. It was you. He said the second time was the night of Hijrah. No one else was there for the Prophet. I slept in his place. Is this true? All of his companions said, Ya Amir al-Mu'minin, you're right, this is true. He said the third time was in Badr, when the children of Rabi'a came. Utbah ibn Rabi'a, Shayba ibn Rabi'a, Walid ibn Utbah. He said the 2 sons of Rabi'a had come to put an end to Islam. Nobody stood in front of them except me. Is this true? They all said, yes, Ya Amir al-Mu'minin, you're right. Number 4, he said in Uhud, everyone ran away except I stood with the Prophet. Is this true? They said, yes, Ya Amir al-Mu'minin, this is true. He said number 5, what happened in number 5? He said number 5 was the battle of Ahzab. When Amr came like an intoxicated camel and no one even wanted a piece of him, and the Prophet was pleading to the Muslims for someone to stand up and nobody would stand up. Is this true that I was the one who put an end to the life of Amr and I was part of the reason why they left? They said, yes, Ya Ibn Amir al-Mu'minin. Yes, Ya Amir al-Mu'minin, this is true. 6, he said the battle of Khaybar. When we were stuck and we couldn't push forward, and the Prophet said, tomorrow I will give the flag to the one who loves Allah and Allah loves him. And then we were able to tear the gate of Khaybar. Is this true? They said, Ya Amir al-Mu'minin, you're right, this is true. And this Jewish man said number 7. What's number 7? He said number 7 was that time when I had to take the message of Bara'ah from Medina to Mecca, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted to cleanse Mecca of all shirk. This is after the conquest of Mecca. And he says, I took this letter, and the way they were looking at me was such that if they could, they would have torn me into pieces. But the Prophet said, Ya Ali, you have to go deliver this message. And I went and delivered this message. He said, these are the 7 times the Prophet had nobody, and I was the only one to support the Prophet. Recite a salawat, please. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. The narrations continue, the story continues, that at this point, the Prophet started to create dispute even between Quraysh and Bani Qurayza. And with his tactics and with his strategy, he created this sense between the two that they started to not trust one another anymore. And the story is a little bit longer and we don't have time, inshallah, I'm wrapping up. So they started to not trust one another. And Bani Qurayza said, you know what, if we do all of this and Quraysh doesn't come, we're going to be left alone with Muhammad. And Quraysh said, well, if we do all of this and Bani Qurayza, when we get in there, they support Muhammad, then we're going to have a problem. And so because of this, this started to create even more problems amongst them. This continued until the Prophet went to the masjid one day. And he prayed to Allah and he said, Ya Allah, if these Ahzab don't leave, you will not be worshipped on earth anymore. And the narration says this happened a number of days. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. Until finally, after a number of days, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent that last piece of the puzzle. And in this, there's a lesson that even when the Prophet prays, sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will delay the response to his dua. Let alone you and I. And the narration of Al-Imam As-Sadiq, salawatullahi alayhi. The narration of the 6th Imam says, when that time came that Musa raised his hands and he did dua against Fir'aun, and he said, Ya Allah, get rid of Fir'aun. And the Quran said, Ustujibat da'watukuma. Your dua has been responded to. Your dua has been accepted. We have heard your dua. The narration of the 6th Imam says, from that day until the day that Fir'aun actually drowned in the water, took 40 years. 40 years. This is a prophet of Allah. He waited 40 years. His dua though was heard at that moment. But how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responds to this dua, it's not even in our hands. Whether we like it, don't like it, this is our servitude towards Him. We only beg what He wants to give, how He wants to give, when He wants to give, it's not in our hands. The Prophet went to the masjid the first day, nothing happened. Second day, this is the Prophet of God who's praying. What, his dua is not heard? His dua is heard. But now's not the right time. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala still wants to test these Muslims. By the fourth, fifth day, then they say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent two things. And these two things were the last piece of the puzzle. He sent the wind that was blowing so heavily that the tents of Ahzab could no longer bear to stay there. The wind was blowing these tents. And their fire, they couldn't even get a fire going at that point. And now it was too difficult for them. And the narration says, and the Quran says that we also sent an army that they could not see. And this was the army of the angels. And some scholars say that the wind was the work of the angels. And the angels surrounded them and they were reciting takbir in the midst of this wind that's coming that you can't even see in front of you. And they hear takbir around them. It built even fear in their hearts. And the narration says the Prophet sent his companion Hudayfa. Hudayfa didn't want to go, but the Prophet told him, you have to go and go and see what are they doing. Go get some news from them. And he couldn't send Ali and this person and that person because they would have known who these individuals are. He had to send someone that Quraysh doesn't know. So he sent Hudayfa. Hudayfa went. He said, I looked and I saw that their tents were getting blown away. And I saw Abu Sufyan himself was not even able to get his things together. He got on his camel in such a rush to leave that he forgot that his camel is still tied down. And they left. The Prophet then turned his attention to Bani Qurayza, south of Medina. When he came to Bani Qurayza, it's a long story. The Prophet did not spare the lives of the men. And you and I sit there and say, this is very cruel. How could the Prophet potentially do this? These were people, if the Prophet had spared them, they would have killed many more of the Muslims. When someone comes and attacks you in the middle of the night, and he has a gun to your head, and then all of a sudden, miraculously, he has a heart attack. Do you sit there and say, oh Allah, you're so cruel, why did you take his life? You should have let him just come and kill me. Or do you say, oh Allah, thank you for this miracle? This is why if the Prophet doesn't spare the life of a person, it's because he knows, and they already showed this. They were already attacking these women and children. He already knows they're going to come back. They're going to take twice as many lives. And I say this because this part, Orientalists and Islamophobes have gone on and on about, yes, this Muhammad, he had issues with Jews and he was anti-Semitic. He himself was the son of a child of Ismail alayhi salam, but somehow he's anti-Semitic. And then they continued on and on about this. And let me just say this, the Prophet never, when he was dealing with any of the Jewish tribes, did he ever say in one of his letters, you're going to have to go through this because you're Jewish. Never. Never said because you come from this tribe or that tribe. No, we had a peace treaty. You tried to attack us and kill us. This is why the Prophet had to do this. This Ahzab leave, everyone leaves, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that this moment became such a key moment in history. Years later, when the Prophet went to Mecca and he had the conquest of Mecca, he held on to the frame of the door of the Kaaba. He said, La ilaha illallah, wahdahu la sharika lah. There's no God but Allah. Sadaqa wa'dahu. He did exactly as he had promised. Wa anjaza wa'dahu. And he did exactly at what he had told us. وَهَزَمَ الْأَحْزَابَ وَحْدَهُ. And he was the one who defeated all of the Ahzab together by himself. And the Quran says, وَكَفَى اللَّهُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ الْقِتَالِ. The Quran says, on that day we made it such that the Muslims did not even have to go to war. But here's the point. Why didn't these Muslims have to go to war? Why was it that when these mushrikeen came 10,000 strong, these Muslims never even had to go to war against them? Why? A big piece of it is because of what Ali did. And this is why some of the companions of the Prophet, when they used to recite this verse of the Quran, they used to say, وَكَفَى اللَّهُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ الْقِتَالَ. And then in the interpretation, they say, بِعَلِيٍّ. Because of the warrior that is Ali. And Imam al-Sadiq says there's because of the fight of Ali that they had so much fear in their hearts that even if they stay here and they make it to the side, the warrior that they have to deal with. And this is the one lesson of the Battle of Ahzab. This is the one lesson you have to walk away with today. The bravery of Ali and the way he fights with his sword and all of this is all good and wonderful. What makes Ali special and is a badge of honor for him, a badge of honor that no other companion of the Prophet will have to the same extent, is that he was the vessel through which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would get his work done. He is the medium through which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gets his will implemented on earth. And this is the lesson for you and I. You want to be like Ali? See what is the work of Allah and try to be the vessel. Sometimes that work is feeding an orphan. Sometimes that work is guiding your generation. Sometimes your work is helping people who are in need. Sometimes that work can come in a multitude of different ways. What is the work of Allah? And be that vessel. And maybe you and I will walk in the footsteps of Ali a little bit. وَكَفَى اللَّهُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ الْقِتَالَ, because of the role that Ali played. Because he was the medium of the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. With that, inshallah, we'll end tonight's talk. Let us take a moment to recite Surah Al-Fatiha for all of your marhumin and marhumat, especially the marhumin and marhumat of the sponsors of tonight's program, with a loud salawat ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.